Rain had a way of making the city sound lonely. Every passing car sent shimmering ribbons of water across the empty street outside our apartment building, and the steady tapping against the windows blurred the lights into pale streaks. I had been halfway through a late-night movie, barely paying attention, when 3 soft knocks echoed against my bedroom door. They were so hesitant that I almost thought I had imagined them. Lucas never knocked on my door. We had shared this apartment for almost 2 years, and if he needed anything, he usually shouted from the kitchen or texted me from 10 feet away. I pulled the door open and found him standing there, soaked from head to toe. His dark jacket clung to his shoulders, rainwater dripping onto the hardwood floor, his blonde hair plastered against his forehead. His eyes were red, not from the cold, but from holding back something much heavier. In one hand, he still carried the small paper gift bag he had left with that evening, now crushed and damp around the edges. Whatever had been inside was hidden, but I noticed a silver ribbon hanging loose, swinging gently with every shallow breath he took. For several long seconds, neither of us said anything. Lucas had always been the kind of person who filled silence with jokes or random stories about work, but tonight he looked like someone who had forgotten how to speak. Finally, he forced out a quiet laugh that sounded nothing like him. "Emily ended it," he whispered. "Just like that." His voice cracked on the last word before he lowered his eyes to the floor. "She said she didn't love me anymore." I felt 100 questions rise in my mind, but none of them seemed important. I didn't ask what happened. I didn't ask whose fault it was. I didn't ask if he wanted me to call someone. Instead, I stepped aside without saying a word. Lucas didn't move. He stood there gripping the ruined gift bag until his knuckles turned pale. Then he looked up at me with an expression so vulnerable it almost hurt to witness. "Can I sleep in your room tonight?" he asked softly. I don't want to be alone." It was the first time since we'd become roommates that he had ever asked something like that. Lucas loved his own space. He loved routine. He loved shutting his bedroom door every night with military precision. Hearing those words told me more than any explanation ever could. "Yeah," I answered immediately. "Of course." Relief flickered across his face so briefly that I almost missed it. He slipped off his wet sneakers by the door and quietly followed me inside. I handed him one of my clean sweatshirts and a dry pair of athletic pants while I tossed his damp jacket over the back of a chair. A few minutes later he returned, looking exhausted rather than comfortable, the oversized sweatshirt hanging loosely from his frame. I pulled an extra blanket from the closet and spread it across the bed without making a big deal out of it. The room was small, barely large enough for a full-size bed, an old dresser, and a desk covered with sketchbooks, but somehow it felt warmer than the rest of the apartment. Lucas sat carefully on the edge of the mattress, staring at his hands. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't awkward. Rain continued tapping against the window while the clock on my nightstand quietly marked each passing second. Eventually he spoke again, his voice almost lost beneath the storm. "I thought she was going to say yes tonight." His thumb brushed absent-mindedly against the damp paper bag resting beside him. "I had everything planned." I nodded once. "I'm sorry." He shook his head. "Everyone keeps telling me I'll be okay." A tired smile crossed his face before disappearing just as quickly. "I don't want someone to tell me I'm okay. I just don't want to feel like I'm by myself." I sat down beside him, leaving enough space that he never felt crowded. "Then you don't have to be alone tonight," I said quietly. That was all. No speeches. No advice. No empty promises about tomorrow being better. We simply listened to the rain together until Lucas leaned back against the headboard and slowly released the first deep breath he had taken since walking through my door. For the first time that night, the apartment no longer felt quite so empty. Lucas fell asleep sometime after 2 in the morning, though I doubted he even realized when exhaustion finally won. The rain had softened into a quiet whisper against the glass, leaving the apartment wrapped in a peaceful silence that felt strangely unfamiliar. I remained awake, staring at the faint glow from the digital clock on my nightstand. Every few minutes I glanced toward Lucas without meaning to. Even in sleep, his face carried the weight of the evening. His eyebrows tightened from time to time as though his dreams refused to let him escape whatever words Emily had left him with. I looked away each time, reminding myself that this was exactly who I had always promised to be for him. Just a roommate. Just a friend. Nothing more. That promise had become second nature almost 2 years ago, the afternoon Lucas Bennett had carried 3 overflowing cardboard boxes into our tiny apartment while apologizing every 30 seconds for taking up too much space. He had smiled at me before we had even finished introducing ourselves, and somehow the place had felt less empty from that moment on. I never intended to fall in love with him. Feelings like that were never part of the lease agreement. They arrived quietly through ordinary moments that nobody else would have noticed. It was the way he always remembered to buy my favorite coffee without asking. The way he left the hallway light on whenever I worked late because he knew I hated walking into a dark apartment. The way he celebrated every freelance design project I completed as though I had won an Oscar. Little things. Tiny pieces of kindness that slowly built a home around my heart without him ever realizing it. The difficult part was that Lucas never hid who he believed he was. Every few months, there was another date. Another woman whose name floated through casual conversations over breakfast. Sometimes it lasted a week. Sometimes several months. Emily had lasted almost a year, longer than anyone before her. I had met her several times. She was thoughtful, funny, and genuinely cared about him. Watching them together had been painful, but I wanted Lucas to be happy more than I wanted anything for myself. So I smiled, listened to stories about weekend trips, and quietly buried every impossible hope a little deeper. There were evenings when I caught myself wondering what life might have looked like if circumstances had been different, but those thoughts always ended the same way. Lucas was straight. Lucas was my best friend. Those were facts, and facts did not change simply because my heart wished they would. A quiet sound pulled me back to the present. Lucas shifted beneath the blanket, letting out a slow breath before his hand brushed against the edge of the mattress. His fingers searched aimlessly through the darkness until they found the sleeve of my sweatshirt. He did not wake. He simply held on as though reassuring himself that someone was still there. My chest tightened so suddenly that I had to look toward the ceiling instead of at him. It would have been so easy to misunderstand a moment like this, to pretend it meant something more than grief and loneliness. I refused to do that. Lucas deserved honesty, even if that honesty existed only inside my own mind. He was hurting, and tonight my job was not to imagine a future that did not exist. My job was simply to help him survive one terrible night. I gently adjusted the blanket that had slipped from his shoulder, careful not to wake him. His breathing gradually became steadier, the tension leaving his face one slow breath at a time. Outside, the clouds finally began to break apart, allowing pale moonlight to spill across the room. It rested softly against the floor between our bed and the closed bedroom door, making the familiar space seem different somehow. I could not explain why, but for the first time since we had become roommates, that ordinary little room no longer felt like two people sharing an apartment. It felt like the place where something invisible had quietly begun to change, even if neither of us understood what that change would eventually ask of us. I thought helping Lucas through a broken heart would mean reminding him to eat, making sure he got enough sleep, or convincing him to leave the apartment once in a while. I never expected healing to happen through ordinary mornings that looked too simple to matter. It began with breakfast. 3 days after the storm, I woke to the smell of bacon and fresh coffee drifting through the apartment. Lucas stood in the kitchen wearing one of his old college sweatshirts, awkwardly flipping pancakes with the concentration of someone solving a difficult puzzle. When he noticed me, he smiled for the first time since Emily left. It was not the bright, effortless grin I remembered, but it was real. "I figured I owed you breakfast," he said. "You kind of saved me the other night." I laughed softly and reached for 2 plates. We ate by the window while the city slowly came to life below us. There was no heavy conversation about heartbreak. Instead, we argued over whether blueberry pancakes were better than chocolate chip pancakes, and somehow that felt exactly right. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm neither of us planned. On Saturday mornings, we walked to the neighborhood grocery store together because Lucas insisted I always forgot something important if I shopped alone. He pushed the cart while pretending to judge every cereal box as though he were hosting a cooking competition. I rolled my eyes every single time, even though I secretly looked forward to it. On weekdays, if I worked late from home, my phone would buzz with a message from Lucas asking if I wanted anything from the coffee shop downstairs. Sometimes it was nothing more than a picture of an oddly shaped muffin with the caption, "This one looks like it has seen some things." Other times he sent a photo of a golden retriever he met outside his office because he knew dogs could always make me smile. I found myself replying almost instantly, even when I was in the middle of a deadline. Those tiny conversations slowly became the best part of my day. Lucas changed too, although I doubted he noticed it at first. During the first week after the breakup, Emily's name surfaced often. A song on the radio reminded him of a road trip they had taken. A restaurant downtown brought back memories of their anniversary dinner. He apologized every time he mentioned her, as though speaking about his own past might somehow burden me. I always told him he never had to apologize. Then one afternoon, while we carried grocery bags up the apartment stairs, he stopped halfway to catch his breath and looked at me with an expression filled more with surprise than sadness. "You know something?" he said. "I just realized I have not thought about Emily all day." He sounded almost guilty admitting it. "Is that terrible?" I shook my head. "No, it means you kept living." Lucas nodded slowly, considering those words longer than I expected. A few evenings later, he stayed late at work because a project ran behind schedule. I was sketching at my desk when my phone vibrated. "Leaving now," his message read. "Save me some pasta if there is any left." Without thinking, I smiled. 20 minutes later, he walked through the front door, carrying 2 slices of cheesecake from the bakery down the street. "They only had one flavor left," he said with a shrug. "I remembered you like this one." We ate dessert at the kitchen counter while talking about everything except the past. As I watched him laugh over a ridiculous story about his coworker accidentally sending an office email to the wrong department, I realized I had not seen that version of Lucas in months. Across the counter, Lucas suddenly grew quiet. He looked around our small apartment before meeting my eyes. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "every day on my way home, I keep thinking about getting back here." He hesitated before adding the words that made my heart stumble. "Not because of the apartment, because I know you are waiting here." Somehow that has become the best part of my day. I had always believed that healing arrived with dramatic moments, the kind people remembered for years. Instead, it slipped quietly into our lives through familiar routines and conversations that stretched long after midnight. It became normal for Lucas to knock gently on my bedroom door with 2 mugs of tea balanced in his hands, asking if I was still awake. Most nights I was. We would sit against the headboard with the bedroom window cracked open just enough to let the cool evening air drift inside, while the city lights shimmered beyond the glass. Sometimes we talked about work. Sometimes about old movies, childhood memories, or ridiculous dreams we had once believed would come true. Other nights, we simply listened to the silence without feeling pressured to fill it. One Thursday evening, nearly a month after Emily had left, Lucas was unusually quiet. He stared into his mug for so long that the tea had almost gone cold before he finally spoke. "There is something I never told you about the night we broke up," he said. His voice carried none of the sharp pain I had heard before. Instead, it sounded thoughtful, almost uncertain. I looked toward him without interrupting. Lucas slowly rubbed the side of the mug with his thumb as though searching for the right words. "It was not just that she said she did not love me anymore." He let out a slow breath. "She said something else that has been stuck in my head every single day." He laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. At first I thought she was just trying to hurt me. My chest tightened without knowing why. Lucas finally looked at me. "Emily said she realized I always smiled differently whenever I came home to you." I blinked, unsure whether I had heard him correctly. He continued before I could respond. "She said she could tell the difference. She told me that every time I talked about you, my face changed. She even joked once that she was jealous of my roommate." He shook his head slowly. That night she was not joking anymore. The room became impossibly still. Outside, the distant sound of traffic faded beneath the quiet hum of the air conditioner. Lucas leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. "I argued with her," he admitted. "I told her she was imagining things. I said you were just my best friend. My roommate. That was all." He smiled to himself before opening his eyes again. I kept repeating it because I believed it. I swallowed carefully, afraid that even breathing too loudly might interrupt whatever he was trying to understand. Then I came home that night. He looked around my room, letting his eyes rest on the shelves of books, the sketch pads stacked beside my desk, and the small lamp that had become the background to so many late-night conversations. "You never asked me to explain everything. You never told me how I was supposed to feel. You just stayed." His voice softened. "I have spent weeks thinking about that." He laughed quietly again. "It is strange. Emily was the person I thought I was building a future with, but when everything fell apart, the only place I wanted to be was here." I could not find any words that felt safe enough to say. Lucas rested his elbows on his knees, staring toward the floor. Do you know what else I realized? He asked. I have never had to perform around you. His expression relaxed into a peaceful smile that seemed completely different from the confident grin he showed the rest of the world. With everyone else, I always feel like I need to be funnier, more successful, more interesting, or more confident. Around you. He paused for several seconds before finishing the thought. Around you, I can have a terrible day, say absolutely nothing, and somehow I still feel understood. My heart beat so loudly I wondered if he could hear it. Lucas looked at me with calm, searching eyes. Maybe Emily was wrong about why I smiled, he said gently. But she was right about one thing. He looked around the room once more before meeting my gaze. Coming home has never been about the apartment. Somehow, without realizing it, home has always started wherever you were. After that conversation, something subtle shifted between us. Nothing dramatic changed overnight. Lucas did not wake up the next morning with all the answers, and I certainly did not expect him to. Instead, the questions became part of our everyday lives, quietly sitting beside us during breakfast, riding with us on our walks through the neighborhood, and lingering in the silence whenever we watched the sunset from the apartment balcony. I never asked what he was thinking unless he chose to tell me first. I knew some journeys could not be rushed, especially the ones that led someone back to themselves. A week later, we spent Saturday afternoon wandering through a small farmer's market a few miles from downtown. Lucas insisted we needed fresh vegetables, even though our refrigerator was already full. I suspected he simply wanted an excuse to spend the afternoon outside. We sampled homemade lemonade, listened to an older man playing acoustic guitar beneath a maple tree, and laughed when Lucas unsuccessfully tried to convince me that an enormous sunflower would somehow fit inside our tiny apartment. On the drive home, he remained unusually quiet. His fingers tapped absent-mindedly against the passenger door while he watched neighborhoods drift past the window. When we reached our apartment building, he did not get out of the car right away. He stared through the windshield for several long moments before speaking. Can I ask you something? He said softly. Anything, I answered. He nodded slowly, still looking forward instead of at me. Have you ever been afraid that you misunderstood your own life? His question caught me by surprise, but I waited without interrupting. I keep trying to figure myself out, he continued. Ever since Emily said those things, I cannot stop thinking about them. He rubbed both hands together nervously. I always thought I knew exactly who I was. He laughed quietly. Now I am not so sure anymore. Finally, he turned toward me, his expression open in a way I had never seen before. I do not know if I am gay, he admitted. I do not know if I might be bisexual. Maybe I am just confused after everything that happened. His voice grew even quieter. The labels are not what scares me. I listened carefully, giving him the same patience he had once found in my silence. Lucas took a slow breath before continuing. What scares me is that every time I picture my future now, there is only one person standing beside me. His eyes met mine for only a second before drifting downward again. It is always you. My heart seemed to forget how to beat for a moment. There were words I had imagined hearing countless times, but this was not one of them. It felt far more honest because it carried uncertainty instead of certainty. Lucas was not offering me a confession. He was trusting me with his confusion. I knew how fragile that trust was. I reached over and rested my hand gently on the center console between us, close enough for him to know I was there, but without asking anything from him. Lucas, I said quietly, you do not owe anyone an answer before you are ready. Not me, not your friends, not the world. He looked at me, searching my face as though expecting disappointment. Instead, I smiled. You do not have to decide who you are tonight. You do not have to force yourself into a definition just because it would make other people more comfortable. His shoulders relaxed ever so slightly. I continued. Sometimes people spend so much energy trying to name their feelings that they forget to actually listen to them. Maybe your heart already knows something your mind is still catching up to. Lucas remained silent, absorbing every word. Be patient with yourself, I said. Treat yourself with the same kindness you would show someone you care about. There is nothing wrong with taking your time. A faint smile slowly appeared across his face, softer than any I had seen before. You always make things feel less frightening, he whispered. We sat there until the late afternoon sunlight painted warm golden lines across the dashboard. Finally, Lucas reached for the grocery bag between our seats and laughed quietly. I guess those vegetables have been sitting in the trunk long enough. We carried everything upstairs together, talking about what to cook for dinner as though the conversation in the car had never happened. Yet I noticed something different in the way Lucas walked beside me. The uncertainty had not disappeared, but it no longer looked like something he was running from. For the first time, he seemed willing to walk toward it, one honest step at a time, and somehow that felt like the beginning of the bravest journey either of us had ever taken. The days that followed were quieter, but they carried a different kind of weight. Neither of us mentioned our conversation in the car again, yet it seemed to live quietly between us, changing the way we looked at each other without demanding immediate answers. I noticed Lucas becoming more thoughtful, as though he had stopped running from the questions inside his own heart and had finally decided to walk beside them instead. He spent more evenings at home than before. Sometimes he sat on the couch reading while I sketched at the dining table. Other times we cooked dinner together, laughing whenever one of us accidentally added too much seasoning or forgot to set a timer. Nothing about those evenings looked extraordinary from the outside, but they slowly became the moments I treasured most. One Friday after work, Lucas arrived carrying a small paper bag from the bakery a few blocks away. "They had your favorite cinnamon rolls," he said, placing the bag on the counter with a proud smile. "I got there before they sold out." I looked at him with quiet surprise. "You remembered?" He shrugged as though it were obvious. "Of course I remembered. You always look happier on Fridays when there is cinnamon in the apartment." I laughed, but his answer stayed with me much longer than he probably realized. It was not only me who had been quietly paying attention all these years. Later that evening, we took our coffee onto the apartment balcony. The summer air was warm, and the city below seemed softer beneath the golden light of sunset. We watched people walking their dogs, families returning home, and neighbors greeting one another across the street. Lucas rested his elbows on the railing and smiled to himself. "Can I tell you something strange?" he asked. "You have never needed permission before," I replied. He nodded thoughtfully. "I used to think happiness had to look impressive. A bigger apartment, better vacations, a perfect relationship, a career that everyone admired." He looked down at the coffee cup, warming his hands. "Now I keep thinking about moments like this instead." I waited quietly. "Just sitting here with you somehow feels complete." He seemed almost embarrassed by the admission, but he did not take it back. Maybe I spent years chasing the wrong picture of what happiness was supposed to look like. I stared toward the fading sunlight, carefully choosing my words. "Sometimes we confuse excitement with peace," I said. "Excitement gets our attention. Peace stays after everything else becomes quiet." Lucas turned toward me with an expression that told me he was listening to every word. "Whenever I was dating someone," he continued slowly, "I always wondered whether I was doing enough to make the relationship work. I worried about saying the right thing or planning the perfect weekend." He smiled gently before adding, "I have never felt that pressure with you." My heartbeat quickened, but I remained silent. "With you, I never feel like I have to earn my place. I already belong." His words settled over us with the same calm certainty as the evening breeze. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Lucas laughed softly and shook his head. "I guess I am still figuring everything out." "That is allowed," I answered. "You are not taking a test. You are learning about yourself." He looked at me with grateful eyes. "Thank you for never making me feel like I had to rush." I smiled. Real answers usually arrive at walking speed. Lucas laughed harder this time, the familiar warmth returning to his voice. "You always have a way of saying things that makes my brain finally relax." As darkness slowly replaced the sunset, we carried our empty mugs back inside. Before heading toward his bedroom, Lucas paused in the hallway. He looked at the two bedroom doors facing one another, then back at me. "You know," he said quietly, "a few months ago, I thought this apartment was just where I slept between workdays." His smile softened into something peaceful. "Now I think it became the place where I finally started meeting the real version of myself." I stood there watching him disappear into his room, realizing that neither of us was trying to force the future anymore. We were simply allowing each new day to reveal another honest piece of it. And for the first time since I had met Lucas Bennett, hope no longer felt like something impossible. It felt patient, steady, and quietly waiting for both of us to arrive. About a month passed so quietly that neither of us noticed the calendar changing until the first cool breeze of early fall drifted through our apartment windows. Life had settled into a rhythm that no longer felt temporary. Saturday mornings still belonged to grocery shopping. Sunday afternoons often ended with movies neither of us paid much attention to, and almost every evening ended the same way, with one of us knocking on the other's bedroom door, carrying 2 mugs of coffee or tea. Somewhere along the way, those ordinary routines had stopped feeling like habits and had started feeling like home. One Saturday evening, after cleaning the apartment together, Lucas suggested we walk to the small park a few blocks away. Children were chasing one another across the grass, while families packed up picnic blankets before sunset. We found an empty bench overlooking the pond, where ducks drifted lazily across the calm water. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The silence felt comfortable, the kind that only existed between people who no longer needed constant conversation to know they were understood. Lucas rested his hands together and watched the orange reflection of the setting sun ripple across the pond. Finally, he smiled to himself. "I have been thinking a lot lately," he said. I looked toward him but remained quiet, giving him the space to continue in his own time. For weeks after Emily left, I kept believing my biggest goal was to recover from the breakup. He laughed softly. "I thought healing meant getting back to the person I used to be." He slowly shook his head. "Now I realize I do not even want that version of myself anymore." I felt my heart beat a little faster. Lucas turned toward me, his expression peaceful instead of uncertain. Something changed while I was busy trying to figure myself out. He looked down at the ground before smiling again. Every time I imagined what would make me happy next month or next year, I stopped picturing some perfect relationship or some perfect future. He met my eyes with quiet honesty. I kept picturing simple things. He counted them slowly on his fingers. Making breakfast together. Walking through the grocery store arguing about cereal. Watching terrible movies on rainy nights. Drinking coffee on the balcony before work. His smile grew warmer. Every single picture had you in it. I could not bring myself to interrupt. Lucas took a deep breath. "I finally understand what I have been trying to say for weeks." His voice remained steady. "I do not just want to be healed. I want to keep building ordinary days with you." My throat tightened as I listened. "I want to choose the conversations that never feel forced. I want to choose your terrible jokes that somehow become funny anyway. I want to choose coming home knowing you are here. I want to choose this life, exactly because it is simple." His eyes never left mine. "If you are willing, I want to choose you." The world around us seemed to fade into a gentle blur. The laughter of children, the rustling trees, and the distant sounds of traffic all became part of a quiet background that no longer demanded our attention. I smiled before I even realized I was smiling. "Lucas," I said softly, "I have spent a very long time trying not to hope for this conversation." He looked at me with surprise and tenderness. I let out a slow breath that felt as though I had been holding it for years. The answer was never something I needed to think about. I laughed quietly, feeling lighter than I had in a long time. "My answer has always been yes." Lucas blinked, his eyes beginning to shine. "Always?" he asked almost in a whisper. I nodded. "I fell in love with you long before either of us understood where this story was going. I never expected you to feel the same, and I never wanted to ask you to become someone you were not. Loving you quietly was enough because your happiness mattered more than my wishes." Lucas reached over and gently took my hand, his fingers fitting naturally around mine, as though they had been searching for that place all along. Neither of us hurried the moment. There were no dramatic promises or grand declarations. Only two people sitting side by side beneath the fading evening sky, choosing each other with complete honesty. For the first time, the future no longer felt like a question waiting to be answered. It felt like the next ordinary morning we would wake up and share together. 8 months passed with the quiet confidence of people who no longer questioned whether they belonged in each other's lives. Love did not arrive with dramatic surprises after that evening in the park. Instead, it continued growing through the same ordinary moments that had brought us together in the first place. One Saturday morning, while drinking coffee on our familiar balcony, Lucas looked across the courtyard and pointed toward another unit several floors above ours. "They finally finished renovating that apartment," he said. "It has 2 bedrooms and a little more space." I smiled. "You sound like you have already memorized the listing." He laughed without denying it. "Maybe I have." 2 weeks later, we were carrying cardboard boxes into our new apartment, still inside the same building we had called home for nearly 3 years. Neither of us wanted to leave the neighborhood that had quietly witnessed our story unfold. The elevator ride lasted less than a minute, yet somehow it felt like we had stepped into an entirely new chapter. The apartment was brighter, with larger windows that welcomed the morning sun into every room. One bedroom naturally became our shared space, while the second slowly transformed into a home office. My drawing tablet and shelves of sketchbooks filled one side of the room, while Lucas arranged his laptop, notebooks, and neatly organized files on the other. We joked that it was the only office in the city where meetings occasionally paused because someone wanted to show the other a funny video or ask what they wanted for lunch. Nothing about our routines changed very much, and perhaps that was what made the new apartment feel so special. Every morning, Lucas still prepared coffee before I finished waking up. He always placed my favorite blue mug on the kitchen counter before pouring his own. Weekend grocery trips remained an unbreakable tradition. We still debated which brand of pasta tasted better, whether fresh herbs were worth the extra money, and whether we actually needed dessert or were simply inventing excuses to visit the neighborhood bakery. Somehow we almost always came home carrying cheesecake anyway. Even cooking dinner became its own kind of conversation. Lucas insisted recipes were only suggestions, while I believed measurements existed for a reason. More than once we found ourselves laughing over a pot of soup because one of us had confidently added an ingredient the other thought was completely unnecessary. We never really argued. We simply enjoyed having someone whose opinion mattered enough to discuss the smallest details of everyday life. On quiet evenings, we often worked side by side in the office until one of us looked up and realized hours had passed without either feeling lonely. Sometimes Lucas would stand in the doorway holding 2 cups of tea and announce that we had officially worked enough for one day. Other nights, I would convince him to take a break by challenging him to one round of a board game that inevitably turned into 3. The apartment slowly filled with small reminders of a life built together. A framed photograph from our first weekend road trip rested beside the bookshelf. A blanket Lucas insisted was too soft to replace stayed folded across the living room couch. Magnets from local coffee shops decorated the refrigerator, each one marking another ordinary Saturday we had enjoyed together. None of those things were expensive or extraordinary, yet every object quietly carried a memory that belonged to both of us. One evening, after finishing dinner, we stood by the wide living room window watching the city lights appear one by one as the sun disappeared beyond the skyline. Lucas slipped his hand into mine with the same natural ease that had become part of our everyday lives. "Do you remember how I used to think happiness had to be something big?" he asked. I smiled. "I remember." He looked around the apartment before resting his head lightly against my shoulder. I was wrong. His voice carried the peaceful certainty of someone who had finally stopped searching. "It turns out happiness looks a lot like this. Coffee every morning. Grocery lists on the refrigerator. You reminding me to water the plants because I always forget. Me pretending your movie choices are terrible even though I end up loving them." I laughed softly as he squeezed my hand. "None of it is extraordinary," I said. Lucas smiled without taking his eyes off the lights outside. "Exactly," he answered. "That is why it finally feels like home." Nearly a year after everything changed, Lucas suggested we spend a Saturday at the neighborhood fall fair that returned every October. It was the same fair where, long before either of us understood what we were becoming to each other, we had squeezed into a tiny photo booth because it was raining outside and we needed somewhere dry to wait. Back then, we had laughed at the ridiculous paper hats the machine offered as digital decorations and tucked the printed photo into the kitchen drawer without thinking much about it. Now, as we walked beneath rows of warm string lights with cups of hot apple cider in our hands, Lucas smiled the moment he spotted the familiar red photo booth standing near the entrance. "We should take another one," he said. For comparison, we stepped inside, sitting shoulder to shoulder just as we had years before. The camera counted down while Lucas made an exaggeratedly serious face that lasted less than 2 seconds before both of us burst into laughter. When the strip of photographs slid out of the machine, he held it beside the faded copy he had quietly carried in his wallet all afternoon. In the older picture, we looked like 2 roommates enjoying a random weekend together. In the new one, our smiles carried the quiet confidence of people who no longer had to hide where they belonged. We wandered through the fair for another hour, stopping to watch local musicians, sharing a basket of fresh kettle corn, and debating whether the caramel apples were worth the impossibly long line. As evening settled over the fairgrounds, we found an empty wooden bench overlooking the Ferris wheel. The colorful lights reflected across the nearby pond, reminding me of another bench months earlier where everything had first begun to change. Lucas reached for my hand without hesitation, gently weaving his fingers through mine. He watched families and friends strolling past before speaking in a thoughtful voice. "I have been thinking about that rainy night again." I looked toward him quietly. He smiled to himself. "When I knocked on your bedroom door, I honestly believed I was only looking for a place to sleep." He paused, letting the memory settle between us. "I thought I was running away from the end of something." He squeezed my hand a little more firmly before continuing. "Now I understand that my heart was never leading me toward an ending at all." He turned toward me with eyes filled not with uncertainty, but with gratitude. It was leading me home. I felt my own smile appear before I even realized it. For a moment, I simply looked at him, remembering every ordinary step that had quietly carried us to this bench. The shared breakfasts, the grocery lists, the late-night conversations, the patient silences, the laughter that slowly replaced heartbreak, and the countless little moments that had never seemed important until they became the foundation of everything we were building together. I brushed my thumb gently across the back of his hand. "I used to think home was an address," I said softly. "Then I thought it was an apartment where life felt comfortable." I shook my head with a quiet laugh. "But sometimes home is not a place at all." Lucas waited as I finished the thought. "Sometimes home is simply the person who keeps choosing to stand beside you, even on the ordinary days when nothing remarkable happens." He smiled, his eyes shining beneath the glow of the fair lights. We stayed there until the Ferris wheel completed another slow turn and the first stars appeared above the city. As we finally stood to leave, Lucas slipped the new photo strip into his wallet beside the old one. Neither of us threw the first picture away because it reminded us that the beginning of our story had not started with a dramatic confession or a perfect moment. It had started with quiet kindness, patient listening, shared meals, familiar routines, and the decision to keep showing up for one another every single day. Looking back, I realized that lasting love had never been built by one unforgettable conversation. It had been shaped by countless small acts of care that seemed ordinary at the time, but slowly became extraordinary together. Hand in hand, we walked away from the fair toward the apartment waiting for us across town, already talking about breakfast the next morning, laughing over whether we had enough coffee left for the week, and making simple plans for another ordinary day that neither of us would ever take for granted.